I'll be honest, I'm not trying to hide the fact that Proto Soul is by far my favorite one in the Battle Network series. It's pretty obvious given the fact that I literally named myself after Proto Man, so I've clearly got some love for Proto Man as a character. But as a quick little autobiography, I came up with the name Proto Demon when signing up for Gaia Online a long time ago. Yes, I am old. And yes, this was around the time that I was playing Battle Network 5 non-stop and using Proto Soul as much as was physically possible. So to say that I'm a Proto Soul fan is of course an understatement. But can you really blame me? Unlike the unreliable Medisoul, Proto Soul is an excellent one, and I can't express in words how glad I am that it exists in both Battle Networks 4 and 5. Honestly, what better sword attribute Navi could have been used for the sword-based Double Soul? But I'm not here just to sing Proto Soul's praises. No, I'm actually here to bring up an interesting and niche bit of information about Proto Soul. Did you know that it actually got nerfed in Battle Network 5? Let me explain. Before getting into the details, let me unnecessarily and artificially extend the runtime of this video by going over every detail of Proto Soul, starting with its introduction in Battle Network 4. Proto Soul is of course activated by sacrificing a sword element chip, giving those early sword and wide sword chips you obtain in your starting folder a purpose other than to be used for life sword. The thing that I love about Proto Soul is that it's actually designed perfectly to help empower sword chips, which usually do decent damage, but at the cost of having a lower range than usual. This can be seen in those early sword and wide sword chips, which can deal 80 damage compared to the 20 to 60 damage done by most other early game chips. However, in exchange for the higher power, sword and wide sword can only hit the column directly in front of Mega Man, while long sword only hits up to 2 panels in front of Mega Man. This limited range means that in order to be able to hit enemies in the center or back columns with swords, you might have to first use area grab. Fortunately, the area grab chip does come in the S code alongside the life sword components. This can help with the range issue that most sword chips have, but it only helps if the chips share a code with area grab or its alternative Metagel. But luckily, Proto Soul offers a different solution to the range problem of sword chips. By charging a sword chip while Proto Soul is active, you gain a step sword effect on the chip, letting you move forward 2 panels before using it. This means that, with the normal 3 columns of area, you can reach opponents in their back column with sword chips by using Proto Soul. In addition to the utility provided by Step Sword, Proto Soul also has offensive abilities as well. Specifically, charging sword chips also doubles their damage in addition to giving them the Step Sword ability. This means that those early game sword chips go from dealing 80 damage to a respectable 160 damage. Notably, this increase in damage makes it worthwhile to charge the individual pieces of life sword with Proto Soul rather than to use the program Advance, as dealing 160 damage with 3 sword chips does a total of 480 damage, which is 80 more than a single life sword would do. Lastly, Proto Soul has one more ability that can be considered to be more defensive. While Proto Soul is active, you can press left and B together to put up a reflect shield, blocking most attacks in the game and reflecting 50 damage back to enemies in your row. I really like the inclusion of the reflect ability on Proto Soul, since it mimics Proto Man himself, who puts up a shield in many of the Battle Network games while you battle him. Plus, the damage reflection means that you can do damage at a range with Proto Soul, even if you don't have sword chips available for a turn. So, what exactly changed for Proto Soul going into Battle Network 5? The honest answer is, not really much at all. Just like in the previous game, Proto Soul is once again activated by sacrificing sword chips. But this time around, Proto Soul is always the last one you obtain, since there's no randomness involved in which souls you get like there was in Battle Network 4. As a result, Proto Soul needed to be balanced for the end game, where all that's left to do is to take on Nebula Grey. The best way to do this, of course, was to give Proto Soul as much offensive power as possible. It needed to be able to deal enough damage to late game viruses and be useful against Nebula Grey with his 2000 HP. And of course, the best way to give offensive power would be to let Proto Soul deal double damage with swords. Exactly the same as it did in Battle Network 4. And of course, sword chips are also held back by their short range, so why not let Proto Soul's chip charge also give them a step sword effect? So yeah, Capcom basically decided to copy-paste Proto Soul from Battle Network 4 directly into Battle Network 5, to the point that it's not even just the chip charging effects that are still present, but even the reflect shield. Once again, pressing left and B together lets you put up that shield to defend yourself from attacks and reflect 50 damage back to enemies in your column. So if Proto Soul itself hasn't changed, how could it be nerfed? Well, there's also the possibility that Proto Soul got nerfed indirectly by a lack of chips useful to it. I've heard people say in the past that Battle.Network 4's Aqua Soul was a bad one, not because the Soul's abilities were bad, but because there weren't good tools to use with it. But if we look at the chips available to be used with Proto Soul, we could actually say that Proto Soul got indirectly buffed in Battle.Network 5 instead of nerfed. Looking at the sword chips that are available in Battle.Network 5, we can see that there are two new ones for Proto Soul to use, and they're both really good. The katana chips attack twice, first in a wide sword range, then a long sword range. If an enemy is directly in front of you when you use katana, they get hit by both swords, and both hits would deal double damage if the chip is charged with Proto Soul. The other new sword chip is Moonblade, which deals damage on panels all around Mega Man. This chip is exceptionally good with Proto Soul since you can charge it to step into your enemy's center panel, letting you land guaranteed hits with that chip. So if Proto Soul is exactly the same as it was in Battle.Network 4, and the new chips are actually a buff to it, how can I say that Proto Soul got nerfed? Well, the truth is that I've actually already shown you how Proto Soul got nerfed. Take a look at this clip of me using Proto Soul in Battle.Network 4. Do you see anything interesting here? In my two most recent videos, I've discussed the topic of flashing in Mega Man Battle.Network games. To briefly summarize, flashing is when you hit an enemy Navi with a chip or charge attack, and they go into the invisible state, similar to when you use the Invis chip. This mechanic of the game is called flashing because that's exactly what it looks like. The enemy Navi looks intangible as their model flashes on the screen. Flashing is important because it prevents you from just using every chip in your hand back to back. You need to be patient and wait for the flashing to end before you launch your next attack. And this is where the minor difference in Proto Soul between the two games exists. In Battle.Network 4, Proto Soul removes flashing from all sword type attacks. This includes both sword chips as well as Proto Soul's wide sword charge attack. None of them cause flashing on enemies, which means that you can use every sword chip in your arsenal back to back without having to wait for flashing to expire. In essence, Proto Soul in Battle.Network 4 isn't just about power, it's just as much about speed, letting you pull off fast, successive sword strikes against your opponent. I can't be certain about why Proto Soul ended up getting nerfed in Battle.Network 5, but I assume it might have something to do with the fact that more sword chips were introduced to the game. Katana 1 comes in the S code, and Moonblade 3 comes in the L code, both of which are shared by the common sword and blade chips, as well as with area grab. Capcom likely thought that Proto Soul would be too powerful in Battle.Network 5 if it didn't receive some sort of nerf, and so they decided to remove that one minor detail. Proto Soul just no longer prevents flashing on sword chips in Battle.Network 5. This of course means that in between attacks, you actually have to wait for flashing to expire now. It really is that simple. Generally, battle chips that don't cause flashing are pretty strong, since they can be used in combos together for quick damage. The fact that Proto Soul didn't have flashing on sword attacks in Battle.Network 4 was a really strong ability, and I'm not surprised that it was removed going into Battle.Network 5. As much as I would have loved to be able to use 4 Moonblades in a row without worrying about enemies flashing, I think that would have been just a bit too strong. So, fair play to Capcom for removing that ability from Proto Soul in Battle.Network 5. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel for some more Battle.Network content. I make these short essay style videos, and I have 2 series relating to Battle.Network, which discuss chip folders that I've used in the various games, or details about specific chips throughout the series. And if you're a fan of Pokemon, I am too. I also do Pokemon Nuzlocke and other runs of those games as well. And as always, thanks for watching.